I'm Afshin Ratansi, and you're watching the season finale of Going Underground before our return after Easter, coming up in this special edition. The fallout of the dirty war on the NHS, with disease striking at the heart of government, and as UK Health Service staff die from coronavirus without protective equipment or adequate testing. Going Underground speaks to legendary journalist and filmmaker John Pilger about neoliberal destruction in a time of neoliberal plague. Plus, what does the coronavirus pandemic mean for imprisoned WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange and NATO nation imperialism using coronavirus as a cover for covert and overt wars all around the world? All this and more coming up in today's Going Underground, but let's go straight to John Pilger, who's filmed the dirty war in the NHS, arguably predicted the kind of crisis today at the heart of Britain's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. He joins me from Sydney in Australia. John, thanks so much for coming on. Before we get even to specifics, millions of people watching this will know that your films, your work casts doubt on NATO nation governments and other governments. Can we trust our governments in what they say to us about coronavirus?
No, we can't. Absolutely not. That this virus has managed to spread through modern developed societies, especially Britain, is a crime. Do you know, in 2016, a drill called Exercise Cygnus, and that was a drill to practice for a pandemic, happened in London, and the whole drill was laid out. The result of that was that the health service was overwhelmed. There weren't enough beds. There weren't enough ICU beds. There weren't enough ventilators. There weren't enough clinicians in the right place. The whole system, which had been the health service, which had been battered by cuts and privatization for years, failed. And the chief medical officer then in 2016 asked the government to heed the warning of what they'd demonstrated very clearly. And yet the Department of Health in London suppressed the documents which had the conclusions of this drill. They kept them from going public. Now that is only 4 years ago. So they knew the whole preparedness for this should have been in place. But of course they knew they couldn't put it in place because the government had devastated the National Health Service since the 2012 Health and Social Care Act. Privatization had subverted the health service to the point where it couldn't possibly respond as it should have to the pandemic. And we've seen what's happened. Not enough ventilators. The whole concept of mass testing, which has been so successful in other countries, especially Germany, and should have been right across Britain, didn't happen in Britain. So that's where it's more than a scandal in terms of what this coronavirus has meant to the societies that it has ravaged, and especially to Britain. It's a crime.
I want to get to the world in a moment, but over here, the Queen, the Prime Minister, the government, they're all praising the National Health Service. In fact, every aspect of this society, including the media, is praising the National Health Service. What evidence? No mention of privatization in the media here, not even that the new Labour leader's top advisor used to work in private healthcare lobbying. What evidence do you have that privatization is even an important context in which to understand Britain's response to coronavirus?
Well, of course they should praise it. It's beloved in Britain. And when it began in 1948, it was set up, as Aneurin and Bevan made clear, to give the British people, and I quote, freedom from fear. Isn't that ironic? We now have a state of fear due to this virus, and the National Health Service was set up to give the people freedom from fear. It's not the health service, it's not the people who work in the health service, it's not the clinicians, it's not all the support people in the health service, it's not those who are at the very moment saving the life of the Prime Minister, but it is those who have undermined the health service, particularly with legislation in 2012 that allowed in privateers that devastated whole areas of it, and also that the whole social care system in Britain, which was an extension of the health service, was privatised almost entirely, both by Labour and Tory governments beginning in the 1990s. And for the government then to stand up with its theorists, its modellers, who keep changing their mind. For one, at one moment, according to the Imperial College people, 250,000 people are going to die in Britain. No, wait a minute, it's only 20,000. But no, it's not really 20,000 because they're going to die anyway. I mean, this kind of bizarre response, public response to something that the health service at its peak, fully funded, not cut back, driven by its clinical staff and not by bureaucrats, it would have coped with that. I do believe, and it's only a guess, from my own knowledge of investigating the health service over several years, that the NHS would have coped with the onslaught of this virus. I do believe that there would have been mass testing, that all the intelligent application of medical expertise, that would have happened in Britain. It didn't happen. It didn't happen because the governments, both Tory and Labour, allowed the health service to be subverted over this time. As I say, it's more than a scandal, it's a lie, it's a crime.
Before Boris Johnson was sent to intensive care at St Thomas's Hospital, just near this studio, he was giving press briefings flanked by Sir Patrick Vallance, who used to work at GSK. I just wondered what you thought of the influence of big pharmaceutical companies on the context in which we understand coronavirus. I know your most recent film points to Sir Simon Stevens, the boss of NHS England, as being suspect because of his work in private healthcare in the United States.
Well, Simon Stevens, knighted by the Tory government, spent 10 years as a senior executive promoting private healthcare in the United States for one of the most infamous private health insurance company, United Health, whose chief executive officer was involved in the biggest share scandal in American corporate history. That had nothing to do personally with Stevens, of course, but that was the ladder that Stevens was climbed before he was plucked out of there by David Cameron's coalition government, and I think from 2014 made head of NHS England. And under Stevens' watch, as of November last year, bed capacity in the health service had dropped to 127,000, the lowest ever, when you think that when the health service began in 1948, it was well over 400,000 beds. But bed capacity dropped to the lowest ever and the lowest in Europe. The health service was always proud, and rightly so, of that its bed capacity was one of the highest in the world, but cut away, cutting to such a degree that the 4% increase in the health services budget just to keep it on track was cut back to 1%, had a devastating effect. And that's why there is a political reason why people are suffering from coronavirus. Many of them may not want to confront that, but it's so. The reason is that the National Health Service the visionary National Health Service, the world's first public health service, was decimated over a period of time, and if you read the Thatcherite documents, by stealth. That's the word they use, by stealth, surreptitiously, since the 1980s, speeded up through the years of New Labour, but especially accelerating from 2012 under the David Cameron-led coalition government.
We all hope that fewer people will die here from coronavirus than austerity, which the UN Special Rapporteur said was a political decision here in Britain. Do you think that consciousness about coronavirus has only been created because it is affecting elites? Because obviously there were reports of 100,000 or more dying, at least, from austerity policies after the bank bailouts of 2008.
Well, yes, you know, Professor Danny Dorling, a very reliable source, and his colleagues at Oxford got into trouble for some thorough research that showed that something like 120,000 people's lives were cut short as a direct result of austerity. And they put their finger on the cuts in the health service. Now, those are actual lives cut short that they investigated. What we've had so far is a lot of speculation from these modelers that has, as I say, gone from the extreme of, I think, 500,000 was one, down to hardly anyone at all. Why are we depending on this charade of statistics when in fact it's very clear from the countries that have succeeded in, if not seeing off the coronavirus, in dealing with it successfully, such as Germany, South Korea, Taiwan, even impoverished Vietnam, certainly in China itself. Why are we not seeing mass testing across the country? Yes, it's happened in pockets and it's happening belatedly, but also it's happening belatedly that ventilators have finally arrived. Now, in that drill exercise in 2016 I mentioned, one of the issues that arose was that there weren't enough ventilators. That's 4 years ago. There weren't enough ventilators.
Well, we invite the Department of Health on the programme. John, I'll just stop you there. More from John Pilger after this short break. Welcome back. I'm still here with John Pilger. You point to austerity, privatization-linked scientists, inaccurate or odd modelling by scientists. The government, before Boris Johnson was taken to intensive care, was briefing that China is the real reason why the world is facing the coronavirus crisis, that China should be considered a pariah nation.
Oh.
Your previous film before the dirty war on NHS was called The Coming War on China. Why do you think Downing Street was briefing that China must be made to pay for coronavirus?
Because a propaganda campaign began in earnest against China in 2011, when President Obama announced what he called the pivot to Asia. And that meant the biggest buildup of US naval forces in the Pacific. But in terms of policy, and this applied to all of the West, the US and its allies, including Britain, that China, there would be a propaganda war against China. The US was desperate to reclaim its dominance, its economic dominance. It has military dominance, but China has risen to a point where it was threatening the whole notion of the US having control over so much of humanity that it's got used to. That propaganda, which of course is historic, it goes into the 19th century, in what the early 20th century and the 19th century, is what the Chinese call the century of humiliation, when the West colonized China, and the Chinese were literally humiliated. one can only spend a short time in China with open eyes and open ears, and you understand very quickly that this is a country that has risen out of the ashes of this history, but like all societies, it feels its history very, very deeply. And the propaganda aimed at China is to offset what is a reality. China as an economic power has risen. And for Johnson and others to start blaming China, whose own conquest, if you like, of this coronavirus has been probably one of the great spectacles of this rather melancholy, awful period that we're going through, to blame China for not giving them information when it's quite clear to anybody who has studied governments in this country, Tory and Labour, New Labour and Tory governments, and their attitude to public health care, that the responsibility lies right at their feet.
Well, despite what the World Health Organization say, media in this country, which doesn't call itself propaganda, says China was lying about coronavirus, it lied about statistics, and it lied about a whistleblower, apparently. Why is it that for you, and there's been no coverage, as far as I can see, of the case of Julian Assange of WikiLeaks in the past 24 hours, a publisher of whistleblowers, why this apparent mismatch between the emphasis here of whistleblowers in China but not the publication or the publishers of whistleblowers here in Britain?
Well, we understand something about government attitudes and so-called policies towards the crisis caused by the coronavirus when we look at the terrible suffering of Julian Assange. You know, a few weeks ago at a bail hearing, a magistrate refused to give this man bail. He has a lung condition. He is a perfect candidate, if you like, for falling victim to a coronavirus, which is ravaging through Britain's prisons. They're not telling us the real figures. There's so much lying going on about this, just simply on a humanitarian basis. The fact that Assange's name is not on the rather short list of prisoners who are being released temporarily on humanitarian grounds is an outrage. How is such a cruelty applied to somebody who's committed no crime, who is convicted of no crime, whose only crime is journalism? It's there for everybody to see. The US wants to extradite him on concocted charges of espionage, charges so ridiculous that they should have been ridiculous in law, that they should have been thrown out on the first day of the hearing in February, but they won't. So my view is, if you want to understand how power is misleading people, let's just use that word, misleading people, during this whole coronavirus crisis, look at the case of Julian Assange. A government that can treat a man with such cruelty, a courts that can treat him with such cruelty is quite capable of a form of that cruelty in its other policies.
Well, it's not only former journalist Boris Johnson who appears to back the legal process regarding Julian Assange. Sir Keir Starmer, the former boss of the Crown Prosecution Service, alleged to have been involved in a conspiracy against Assange, says we must allow the proper extradition process to follow its course.
Well, that's fine. Let's have a proper process. There isn't a proper process, and he should know. He's a QC. There isn't a proper process. Anybody who was witness to the number of hearings last year and certainly this year in February Well, no, there's no process. The court has become a kind of show trial. I mean, people without a preordained view have been so shocked by what they've seen. There is no process. So yes, let's have a proper process. But more than that, Keir Starmer is the leader of the opposition. Opposition is needed more than ever today in Britain. Indeed, that's what democracies are about. And this government and the governments that have gone before it have to be called to account on a number of issues, but especially on the treatment of Julian Assange. The whole world, and we'd be here all day if I described all the jurist organization, the United Nations bodies, distinguished people, United Nations rapporteur on torture, doctors, latest 115 doctors have called on the government to let Julian Assange out, at least while this coronavirus crisis is on. There are so many of them, but they're not in the media. And the media, of course, is a major problem. It's a major problem for Assange in that it's suppressed the truth about Assange. It's a major problem for the coronavirus crisis. So much of this crisis has been media-led by a form of hysteria and worse than that, simply an echo of whatever government wants to say, of whatever its latest modeler wants to stand up behind their lectern and tell us. No critical thinking, no understanding. I mean, wasn't it Robert Peston who told the nation in a tweet that the government was considering, I think his words were, the forced isolation of people over 70. We learned that in a tweet. In other words, something slipped to this reporter. Clearly, he's favourable to the government. That's how we learned about it, before the government told us. Haven't we forgotten that in 2012, there was a landmark report done by University College about the killer disease in Britain. What was that killer disease? It was isolation. Not loneliness, they distinguished it. It's an extraordinary piece of research. It was published both in Britain and the United States, all forgotten.
Well, if that's characterized as a war on the poor, you're known, of course, for your coverage of lies about wars. Antonio Guterres of the United Nations wants a global ceasefire during the coronavirus pandemic. In the context, I have to say, of the Labour Shadow Foreign Secretary, who's just been appointed here, Lisa Dandy, saying Israeli atrocities must not be condemned because it would be anti-Semitic to do so. What do you make of the bombs flying around the world during this time of coronavirus? Israel bombed Syria in the past few days, and of course Saudi Arabia has been bombing Yemen, and US warships are headed towards Venezuela.
Saudi Arabia doesn't give a damn about coronavirus. It hasn't given a damn about so-called world opinion because it's backed by the United States and Britain. Britain is in there not only supplying it with much of its equipment, but helping it identify targets in one of the poorest, if not the poorest country on earth, a country that has been ravaged by a cholera epidemic, where most children suffer extreme malnutrition. Saudi Arabia continues to bomb this country with when I say our, I mean UK and US assistance. More than assistance, they wouldn't be able to do it without the planes, the bombs, and the expertise that come from our countries. But you know, coronavirus hasn't stopped the war of sanctions. It's the war of blockades, rather. A quarter of the world's population is currently under American sanction. That is, it's blockaded in one form or another. One of those countries worst hit by coronavirus is Iran. And the United States has continued to turn the screw on this country, a country that sat down with all the states of the EU, with the United States, with Russia, and signed an agreement. It was Donald Trump that tore it up, and now this country, Iran, can't get the medical supplies it needs. It can't get particularly cancer drugs. This kind of almost medieval siege of countries. Venezuela is another one. And yet, do you know that Venezuela is actually coping with the coronavirus? It's extraordinary. I can't remember what the statistics are, but they're not high. And they've managed to test widely, to track the pattern of the disease, and so on, while they're under blockade from the United States, while American naval ships are sitting off the coast of Venezuela. And I remind you, of course, I don't have to, that Venezuela is actually the source, the greatest source of oil on Earth. These wars go on. One could say that they extend to a war on the protagonist's own people. Look at the unholy mess that the United States is in, with some states locked down and no testing and the disease running like wildfire, in a country where probably some of the most extraordinary medicine and drugs have been practiced, but for a few. There is no unified public health service. That's a war on their own people. Are we an enemy of our own governments? That's a question. It's an interesting question. If we're not, why has, for example, the most extraordinary institution in Britain, why has it been treated so miserably? Why has it been undercut so that when we need it most, it struggles?
John Pilger, thank you. That's it for the show and for this season. We'll be back on the 22nd of April with a brand new series of Going Underground. In the meantime, we'll be showing some of your recent favourite episodes. Until then, wherever you are in the world, keep as safe as you can and join the Underground by following us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and SoundCloud.